The Orchard Keeper by Cormac McCarthy, his debut novel. So, with the announcement that Cormac McCarthy's long awaited novel, The Passenger, would at last see publication later this year, I knew I had to complete reading his existing body of work in preparation for that momentous event. I have copies of all of his books, but I haven't read every last one yet. But I've now got one more checked off the list, and I wanted to go back and read the first one, start kind of chronologically. And The Orchard Keeper was his debut novel, published, I believe, in 1965. This book is as old as my parents, actually. So, after reading this book, I can very much attest that this was a debut. This is not quite on par with what he would later accomplish with books like Blood Meridian or All the Pretty Horses. This is a bit rougher around the edges, and it's also not quite as intrinsically his in terms of identity as his later books would be. This definitely shows its influences on it wears its influences on its sleeves a little bit. But so, that is not at all to say that The Orchard Keeper is a bad book. I don't believe that Cormac McCarthy has written a quote-unquote bad book. He's written one, or actually now two, books that I don't particularly care for myself, the other being Child of God, which I still maintain is his worst book. But this one is probably my second least favorite of his. Although that is not at all to say that this book is bad, and I would never want to dissuade anyone from picking this book up if they are like me and a fan and admirer of Cormac McCarthy's work, and they want to see where he started at. By all means, read this book. It is not bad. It just does not really measure up to his later output. So, what is The Orchard Keeper about? Well, The Orchard Keeper is a work of Southern Gothic fiction, as were his first few books. Cormac McCarthy's first first four books were Southern Gothic books to some degree at least. The Orchard Keeper, Outer Dark, Child of God, and Suttree. After that, he moved into the Western genre with Blood Meridian, and then into the neo-Western genre with the Border Trilogy and No Country for Old Men, and then into the post-apocalyptic genre with The Road. But he has mostly made his home with the Western and the neo-Western genres, and he's kind of left the Southern Gothic genre behind. And I, for one, am thankful because I have rather mixed feelings towards that genre of literature. Some works of Southern Gothic literature are great. The stories of Flannery O'Connor, those are great, and William Faulkner is mostly great, I think. But so many works of literature in that category are a little bit over the top, and some of Faulkner is. I really do think that some of Faulkner's is. There are so many trappings and cliches in that genre that it almost feels a bit silly and sometimes a little bit ludicrous. This book, thankfully, is not like that. This book is much more quiet and not quite so flashy and in your face with its content. This book is, I don't want to say a coming of age story, even though that is nominally, I suppose, what it should be categorized as. But no one really comes of age in this story, and the characters really aren't that well rendered. But then again, that is pretty much par for the course with Cormac McCarthy's writing because he doesn't really care that much about characters. And it's kind of an oddity, I suppose, that he is my favorite author because I believe that character is the most important part of the story, and yet he doesn't really appear, at least, to care that much because his character, the way that he characterizes the characters in his books is so opaque and impenetrable that you get very little insight into their psychology whatsoever. And this book is no exception. This book is the story of John Wesley Ratner, a 14-year-old boy growing up in the hills of Appalachia, which is where Cormac McCarthy himself grew up. And he is kind of mentored by a bootlegger named Marion Silder, who, unbeknownst to him, has actually killed his father. Although that never impacts anything in this plot. And then there's a side plot with an old man named Arthur Ownby who lives in the mountains and does some stuff. And, it's not a plot driven book, and it's also not a character driven book. This book is strange and kind of hard to categorize because it is definitely not driven by plot because there virtually is no plot, and it's not driven by character because the characters are so, again, opaque. They don't really leave an impression. So the real strengths of this book lie in its writing, but as strong as the writing is, and it is strong, it is not quite as good as, again, he would later do in subsequent outings. So, I mean, I'm not going to spoil much of the plot, such as there is. John Wesley grows up and he's friends with, unknowingly friends with the man who killed his father, and there's an old man who shoots at stuff, and that's pretty much it. The writing in this book is mostly gorgeous. It has all the McCarthy hallmarks, but it is definitely distinct from his later writing. For one, we have many, he still doesn't use quotation marks, but we have many, many, many more commas than we do in later McCarthy novels. He doesn't use the and so much, where he just says they did this and they did that and they did this and they did that. He doesn't use the word and so much. He actually uses commas. There are probably more commas in this one little book here, and this is a pretty short book, that my copy was only 246 pages. There are probably more commas in this than in than in the most of his latter books put together. Also, he actually used exclamation marks. That is something that I don't think he has done in a long time. He very much only likes to use periods, even with exclamatory sentences. But in this book, we actually saw some exclamation marks. The sentences are more complex and have different clauses, and they're not quite so punchy and direct. They kind of have a flow and cadence to them, and there's much more punctuation and much different punctuation with the use of exclamation marks. And also, this book, as I said, as I believe I said, it wears its influences on its sleeve, and its influences being primarily Faulkner. Now, I have long heard it said that Cormac McCarthy is an inheritor kind of William Faulkner's legacy. And I never really understood that comparison because I had just been reading his later works, which are primarily westerns, as I said. And William Faulkner never wrote a western. And the way that they're written, I just didn't see it. But now I absolutely do see it. Going back and reading these early books of his, which are Southern Gothic novels, which is the same kind of output that William Faulkner had. I definitely do see it now, and I also see it in the way, again, the way that it's written, because he will switch between past and present like that, and he'll do it with italics, which is a real hallmark of Faulkner, is the use of italics to denote shifts in time. Also, there is a bit of stream of consciousness writing in here, which I don't believe he does anymore now. And yeah, this is definitely indebted to William Faulkner a great deal. But I mean, hey, there's a lot worse people to be indebted to. But such as it stands, this book didn't really do it for me. And again, I want to reiterate that this is not by any means a bad book. I mean, this book actually won an award. I can't recall which one, when it was published as best debut novel, and I don't feel that that's unmerited. But I guess had I read this book first and then gone on to his later books, I wouldn't it wouldn't strike me so instantly and apparently that this was an early effort. But when you read his later books, his masterpieces like Blood Meridian and The Crossing and such, and then you go back to this, it is glaringly apparent that this was the work of a rather fresh faced author. Uh, the writing is good, and you know, to rate it, yeah, to rate The Orchard Keeper, I'd probably give it a C plus. Like it's good, but not really great. The writing is mostly great. It's mostly gorgeous. There is lots of very good metaphors in here and lots of very starkly evoked images. But there were times when the writing veered, I really do feel, into purple prose. Now, purple prose, as we know, is writing that serves no other purpose than to draw attention to itself. There is a distinction between purple prose and just, you know, lofty, aspirational writing. And it's kind of like, you know, they say about pornography. You'll know it when you see it. And I knew it when I saw it in The Orchard Keeper. There is some genuine purple prose in there because he is using words that nobody can possibly know without a dictionary, and he is using them in the most flowery and needlessly showy and flashy ways. There was more than one instance in this book where I was like, okay, you're just going off the deep end with the writing, and that really hurts me to say because as much of a fan as I am of Cormac McCarthy, and largely because of his writing, it really does hurt me to say that he went hardcore purple prose in some sections of this book. Thankfully, they're few and far between, but there were some instances, some passages in this book that I just had to stop and kind of gape at the audacity to write in the way that he did because it went so over the top. And you know, he did a little bit of that in The Crossing. I think The Crossing has a few touches, a few hints of purple prose. But there was some genuine purple prose in this, and unlike unlike Cormac McCarthy's later output, this book doesn't really have much on its mind. You know, another reason, in addition to the great writing, that I am such an admirer of Cormac McCarthy is because his books are usually infused with so much philosophical inquiry and ponderances. Blood Meridian being a 300-page meditation on war and the human capacity for violence. Um, the Crossing being about a lot of things. No Country for Old Men being predominantly about morality and what is the best way to approach which morality is the best to hold in a world that doesn't really reward morality. And The Road being about trying to carry the flame, as they say, to maintain the higher virtues of humanity in a world that has gone savage. That's why I love Cormac McCarthy because his books are deep. They have things to say. This book really didn't, or at least I didn't pick up on it. But you know, maybe I'm just dense and I overlooked something. There were some metaphors in here, imagistic. I think about like the way it opens. There's a very brief, like half-page prologue section, which plays no part whatsoever in the plot and really just was there to put an image in the reader's head. Uh, I don't exactly know what that was trying to say because it didn't appear to have any bearing on the rest of the story. But there is some kind of he's playing more with images here than what he does in his later books. I mean, his later books are highly symbolic, definitely, but he would much of the philosophical content in his later books are more given over to dialogue and actual discussion of the themes they're dealing with. This one is just mainly about impressions and images. So I don't really know what this book was about. Again, a lot of people would call this a coming of age story. It's not because the characters are so opaque and they barely pop up. A large portion, a large quantity of this book's uh, page time was devoted to seemingly inconsequential matters, and it's stuff that Cormac McCarthy would never do now. I don't think, at least, which is like large. There were like pages in this book where he just follows like a cat, like literally just a cat doing cat stuff, and he's writing about this cat walking around, and it's like page after page of this, and I'm just like, what is the point? Like, you have human characters here that you should probably be detailing, and yet you're just talking about a cat for several pages. It was just odd. There were some odd choices here, and it kind of just felt scattershot and not really. It did not feel fully cooked. If there was a point to it, I missed it completely. The characters, I could never have been bothered to care because they're just, and he doesn't even use their names half the time, which is why he'll just refer to them as he. He'll just use like the pronoun he, and like, it'll be several paragraphs where we're just reading about this character and you don't even know who that character is because he won't tell you their name, and you have to piece it together using context, and it just wasn't really that great compared to his later stuff. This is definitely his debut. Uh, again, it's not. I would not put it as low as Child of God. That was his third book, but that was a major step back because that book, I don't really have much positive to say about that book, and I don't have that much positive to say about this book. But it was more palatable than that, at least, because it wasn't so edgy and needlessly shocking and depraved. Rather, it's just kind of bland. It's just kind of meh. Like, the writing is good mostly, although it does veer into some serious bullshit at some points. But overall, the writing is, commendable mostly. The characters are not, and when you're writing a story that's given to so much, that should by rights be driven by character or be preoccupied with character, and then you don't flesh them out any more than he did here, that's not going to work. And I don't think it did work. This book is kind of forgettable. It's not nearly of the same quality as like Blood Meridian or All the Pretty Horses. And so, I mean, but again, this is not a bad book. Okay, it's not. Trust me, his worst book is better than most people's best book. But when you do hold it up against his later and better output, the cracks do show, and they did show to me. But this was his debut. The next book of his I'll read will probably be Outer Dark, which is his second. So I'm eager to see how much he stepped up his game from book one to book two. So yeah, The Orchard Keeper by Cormac McCarthy. Have you read The Orchard Keeper? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it. I would love to hear your take on it and whether you agree or disagree with anything I have said about it here today. If you have not read The Orchard Keeper, I would really just recommend it for the devout McCarthy fans, the completionists, the ones who really love what he does and want to, own every last book that he wrote. If you're just a casual fan, if you've just read Blood Meridian, you don't really have any, drive to read any more of his books. If you're just read that and you're like, hey, that was a pretty good book, but I'm not, interested in anything else, this book is not for you because it's not going to hold up well against that book. So yeah, I would only just recommend this to people who are like me and who just obsessively have to read every last word that this man wrote. But yeah, it's still not a bad book. Trust me, I've read a lot worse. But anyway, so yeah. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, please like, subscribe, help the channel out a little bit. And until next time, peace.